Hi everyone, John here with Fountain Pen Love, and in this video I want to talk about the trinity of writing, which is pen, paper, and ink, and how it affects your doodles. When you're doodling, your nib size, your paper selection, and your ink selection all will have a big role to play in how your final doodle looks and how enjoyable it is to do. So let's dive in, take a look at how these three things affect your doodling, and figure out which are going to work best for you. So one of the first decisions you're going to need to make when you start a doodle is which pen you're going to use. I've got a variety of pens here. I have a fine nib that also is flexible. I have a medium, I have a broad, I have a coarse, which is basically a double broad, and I have a stub nib. So let's take a look at each of these nibs, see how they will influence your doodles and why you might choose one and not choose the other. So starting off with the fine nib here, let's go ahead and pull that out. It is going to be really good for drawing thin lines that are very close together. So if you really want to draw some lines that are not gonna be in danger of touching each other, maybe some curves where you want the lines to be really close, a fine nib is gonna work really well for that. If you want to draw lines that are farther apart, a fine nib can actually look really empty. I don't prefer it for something like that. For that, I'll use something like a medium. So a medium nib is going to work really well for just about everything. It's my general purpose nib for doodling. It's good at making lines that are close together so that they don't look like there's too much space between them, but it also looks fairly filled in. It's good for drawing curved lines. It's good for coloring. If you try and color a space in with this fine, this one's so fine, it really almost just looks like scribbles. There's lots of empty space in there, and you just have to kind of go back and forth over it, which isn't really good in the long run for your paper or for your time. So if you need to fill in space, a medium is the beginning point where I would look at. A broad also works really well for putting down big amounts of ink. You know, you can do it pretty quickly, especially if you have a wetter ink. But when you start drawing parallel lines, a broad can get a little tricky because they can run into each other if you make them too close. This worked pretty well, but I have had plenty of times where a broad has been too much and my lines have run into each other. Looking at a double broad, this is a pretty ridiculous nib to try and doodle with. It's so big. It's not something that I would normally reach for, but since I had it inked up, I figured I'd show it here. It does put down a lot of ink really fast, so coloring in a space will work pretty well with a double broad, but it's not going to be my first choice for doodles. Now, on the big spectrum, we have a stub, and stubs are really tough for doodling. They do lay down a big, wide line, but you get that line variation depending on which direction the nib is going. And anytime you have a curve, it's going to be really hard to get any kind of consistency that just doesn't look good. I've never liked doodling with a stub nib, so for that reason I avoid stubs anytime I'm doodling. You might have different results, you might try them and love them, but personally I do not use stubs when I doodle. My default is typically a medium, sometimes a broad, pretty much never a fine or double broad or anything like that. So medium is my go-to, but I will occasionally use a broad nib if I want to do something a little bit different or have a very specific use. Now, I did mention flex nibs, and those are, again, fairly specific in how I end up using them. In this doodle, you can see I had kind of some line variation that I intentionally got with the flexible nib. Something like this is kind of fun to do, but again, it's not something I do on a regular basis. It's more of a one-off thing of have a flex or a couple flex nibs inked up that I want to play with. It's usually going to be a pattern like this and not any kind of more formal doodle like this or like this. These are really going to be tough with the flex, or they're just not going to take advantage of the flexibility. So a flex, you know, I'll play with it and do something like this, but otherwise pretty much sticking to the mediums and broads. Now the next decision you're going to want to make when you're starting a doodle is what ink you want to use, and typically the ink is going to fall into either a shading or a sheening category. Both have their pros and cons, and I'm going to discuss those really quickly here. So the first thing, let's look at a shading ink, and you can see here all these different lines have a different amount of shading to them. I thought it was really interesting how it looked when they were all put together. And so, I used these shading inks to give this kind of really interesting pattern here. Nothing but parallel lines, but the shading really is what makes this more interesting to look at. So shading inks definitely have a role to play in doodles. You can also look at something like this doodle where we have, again, a highly shading ink. We have lots of lines that are all coming together, and where they touch, where it's more shaded, it's darker. These parts out here where it's not as shaded, where it's lighter, makes kind of almost like a shadow effect going on here. So using shading to give certain effects in a doodle is also something you can do. I really enjoy shading inks when I doodle. I really think they're easier to work with and they give you lots of really interesting visual effects. Another way I use shading is when I do kind of patterns like this where I have lots of points coming together. Something like this pattern really benefits from a high shading ink. So you can see in these browns, the gray it doesn't show as much, but the brown really shows off the shading and you get this darker center point with this lighter outer portion to each doodle. Now on the flip side, sheening inks are something that are really interesting. They're usually a lot of fun to write with. They can be kind of tricky to doodle with. This particular doodle was, you could see it's just a bunch of shapes, little squiggles and dots, was done with Emerald of Chabor, which has both shading and sheening. Let's see if we can get any of the sheen in here. This one's a little tricky to see. This next one here, definitely you can see the sheen. So this red part, this red ink is a high sheening ink. And when I angle the page just a little bit, you can see some gold shows up. That gold is the sheen. So basically it adds visual interest to this doodle. Now this one's interesting in that it also has high shading, and I even used a flex nib. So these gray portions are a shading ink with the flexible nib. The red portion of this doodle is a high sheening ink with I don't know, probably a medium or so, and put them together and you do get a fairly interesting doodle. Now, the downside of using a high sheen ink is it typically does take longer to dry, and it's also much more prone to smear. So because it takes longer to dry and because it has this excess dye that remains on the top of the paper, it is likely to smear. I could probably run my hand across this really hard and make it smear, even though it's been done for a couple of years, I think. High sheen inks are a little tricky to doodle with, but they are really neat looking. They do look cool. They're a lot of fun. They don't always shade. So if you don't like shading, a more saturated ink might be something that's going to be good for you and your doodles. But don't be afraid to play around, even combine shading and sheening inks into one doodle and experiment and see what works best for you. Now another thing you can always do is use more than one ink. So in this example, I did use 2 colors of ink. In this example, I used 2 colors of ink. So don't feel like you're limited to just one color of ink in your doodles. You can always use 2, 3 if you want to. Really, it's your doodle, it's your fun, so you can do whatever you want to do. I tend to stick with 2 at the most, but there's no reason that you can't use 3 or 4 if you want to. So definitely don't feel like you can only use one ink, only use one nib size. You can use a variety of inks and a variety of nibs in your doodles. All right, now one of the last things that I want to mention is paper. And paper comes in a variety of different brands, different types, different sizes. And I think these are all worth considering when you're starting a doodle, which type of paper you want to use and why you want to use it. So one of the first things I would recommend is choosing a size. If you're using a blank piece of paper, it's going to take a lot longer to fill up a large letter size piece of paper like this than a small 4x4 square like this. So choosing a paper size can really affect the time that your doodle takes, how quickly you finish, how quickly you get tired of it. And so if you're just starting out trying something for the first time, I would always suggest using a smaller paper. If it's a notebook, you can use something small like this. This is, I think, an A6 size. And when you compare it to an A5, let's turn these sideways so you can see them. You can see the actual amount of landscape that you have to color here or to doodle in. This is going to get finished a lot faster than this one will. So you can see it doesn't really make a huge difference in which doodles you choose. You can do any doodle on any size of paper pretty much, just the smaller one is going to finish up a lot faster than the larger one. So definitely keep your paper size in mind. If you're using a notebook, again, you might start with something smaller as far as the actual page size goes and number of pages. It's fun to fill up a notebook and finish it. So maybe avoid starting one that has hundreds of pages. And this small Midori notebook is really nice. I used quite a few of these when I was doodling and kind of getting started out because I could fill a page really quickly and I could fill the notebook really quickly as well. So choose wisely. It's not a big deal if you start in something that's too big for you. You can always stop, go to something smaller, and come back later and finish up the bigger one if you want to. You can also just use blank pieces of paper. I've done that a lot. Like this is just a nice little piece of paper I picked up at a pin show somewhere. It was just a sample and put a doodle on it, and it was really fast, really easy, and very, very low commitment. So keep an eye out for stuff like this. You can use pieces of paper that you have, cut them down into smaller pieces. Another thing that you can do, if you have a large piece of paper, again, this is a letter size piece of paper, you know, divide it into 4 different quadrants, and then you can make each quadrant a different doodle, and then you have 4 on one page instead of trying to do all, one entire page with one doodle. So you don't have to fill the entire thing up. You can divide it into quadrants and you can do each one separately. Give you 4 different doodles on one page there. Now there are a few other things to keep in mind when it comes to paper selection, and that is, again, it's similar with the inks. If you want something that shows more sheen, so if you wanted to use a paper that gives you more sheen so that you can use a sheening ink and really get the benefits of that ink, then not all papers are created equal when it comes to showing sheen. You'll want something, this is Tomoe River, it's great at showing sheen, also has really long dry times, so you have that trade-off just like you do with the ink choice. This is gonna have a longer dry time regardless of which ink you use, whether it's sheening, shading, whatever, it is going to take longer to dry than say, that HP Premium 32, great paper, handles ink very, very well, but it does dry very quickly. It also does not show very much sheen. So you want to be conscious of which paper that you use so that you're getting whatever look you're going for in your doodles. Another thing you want to be aware of is if you use a blank paper. I prefer using blank paper for my doodles, but you might use something that has a grid to it. So if you wanted to do, I don't know if I have anything in here that's very ordered, but maybe something like this where maybe you want to stay kind of, on a grid pattern and keep everything similar sized, or keep everything going perfectly straight up and down and horizontally. A grid might work really well for you, and that might be a dot grid, it might be a lined grid. Personally, like I said, I prefer blank paper, but you might also try grids and see how those work for you. Now, one other thing you might have noticed in this notebook, I have a random piece of paper, and the reason for this is something that I use under each doodle as I'm doing it. So I keep it underneath here, so as I'm going around, let's try a different example here. Let's say this one. As I'm drawing all these little lines, that will come through and the pressure will show up on my page beneath. So I like to keep this under each page that I'm doodling on, partly to keep those lines from showing up on the reverse page, but also you can see here, sometimes where there's a lot of overlap on a page, I do get some bleed through. So typically, this is Tomoe River, like I said, it does not bleed through with just a single pen stroke, but when you have a lot that are all coming into a single point like this, you can see we do get bleed through here. So It's these really heavy portions where there's a lot of ink being put down repeatedly where I start to get bleed through, and that will go into the page below if you don't have a piece of paper underneath. So I think as far as the basics go, you never want to choose a paper that's going to feather, that's going to bleed heavily, but sometimes it can't be helped, and so I would definitely always recommend a scrap piece of paper just underneath. So if it does happen to bleed through a little bit, your page below is safe. This also works well for just a single piece of paper. Let's say we are going to use just this A5 piece on a hard countertop. It's not going to be very pleasant to write on. With a piece of paper underneath, it's going to make it a lot more enjoyable to run your pen across this. So I always have just a random junk piece of paper laying around. You can see this one's been used quite a bit for just writing tests and for soaking up any ink that's come through. And it is pretty much something I always have with me when I'm doodling. Now, another thing you'll want to do when you're doodling is protect the top surface of your doodle as well. So I'm always going to keep a piece of paper underneath, but skin oils do affect paper. They do cause feathering, and maybe make your pen skip if you have a lot where your hand has laid in one place for too long. So I always like to keep another piece of paper on top of my working surface so I can come in here, do my doodles, move the paper around. A lot of times you're rotating the book, rotating your paper. So I always have this as a way to protect my piece of paper that I'm doodling on, so that I keep skin oils off of it. I don't smear anything that I've already done. If my hand is just going across all of this, probably gonna smear even if it's dry because this is a sheenier ink. So this will just kind of protect everything and keep it safe. So hopefully that is enough information to get you started with your doodling. You know now that pen selection is important, paper selection is important, ink selection is important. All three of these work together, and really with the proper selection of all three, you're gonna have a great doodle. I hope you found that discussion useful and figured out a few of your own personal preferences. I know when I started really thinking about these three different things and how they related to my doodles, it really caught me off guard at how much they matter. Knowing what your preferences are can make a really big difference in how easy your doodles are and how they look. So keep all of this in mind the next time you start a doodle, and if something isn't working, try something else. Try a different paper, try a different ink, try a different pen, because they all three will have a big impact on your final results. Well, happy doodling. We'll see you next time. Like and subscribe, and take care.